Welcome to the new video of Neurophilos. Get ready to dive into a gripping tale that will leave you breathless, thinking, and inspired. Whether you're here for the mystery, the drama, or the unexpected twists, you're in the right place. Make sure to hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe so you never miss another powerful story. Let's begin.
The invisible wounds of toxic parenting. There is a form of violence that never leaves marks on the skin, yet it alters a person's entire emotional foundation. It does not show up on medical scans, cannot be photographed, and rarely gets acknowledged. This silent harm emerges in childhood, beneath the surface of homes marked by manipulation, inconsistency, and emotional neglect. It shapes the developing brain in ways that follow a person into adulthood. During early childhood, the human brain is in a state of rapid construction. Every experience becomes a building block, and emotional connection is one of the most essential elements. Many assume that food, shelter, and education are the primary pillars of childhood, but psychology reveals something far deeper. It is the emotional bond with caregivers that truly forms the child. When this bond becomes unstable or contaminated by coldness, unpredictability, or emotional abandonment, it does more than cause temporary pain. It creates an invisible wound that continues to echo throughout a person's life. John Bowlby, the British psychiatrist who founded attachment theory, uncovered a disturbing truth. The way a child is treated in their earliest years becomes the blueprint for how they later view themselves, other people, and the world. This is not a poetic idea, it is biological reality. The child's nervous system absorbs patterns of emotional interaction and uses them to construct internal beliefs about love, safety, and worthiness. When parents alternate between affection and rejection, warmth and distance, support and criticism, the child does not understand the inconsistency. Their mind forms a dangerous conclusion: love must be earned. I must be careful not to lose it. Instead of feeling secure in who they are, the child becomes hyper-aware of every emotional shift. They soften their personality, hide their needs, and suppress emotions to avoid upsetting the parent. They learn to walk on emotional eggshells, believing that the smallest misstep could cost them affection. This environment becomes fertile ground for what Bowlby called anxious ambivalent attachment. This form of attachment emerges when caregivers are unpredictable, emotionally absent one day and affectionate the next. The child learns that love is uncertain, anxiety-producing, and dependent on their performance rather than their existence. Slowly, the idea forms that to be loved, I must sacrifice myself. Children who grow up this way develop a distorted emotional dictionary. They confuse love with fear, connection with tension, and affection with self-erasure. And because childhood is the period when the emotional brain is forming its earliest templates, the lessons learned during those years become deeply embedded. These internal patterns quietly extend into the child's later environments, friendships, school life, workplace dynamics, and eventually romantic relationships. The tragedy is that most people raised by toxic parents do not recognize their upbringing as emotional abuse. They were told to be grateful simply for having food on the table or a roof over their heads. They were taught to feel guilty for being sad or overwhelmed. They learned that expressing pain meant they were ungrateful. This confusion between love and suffering becomes the emotional script they carry forward. As adults, many continue to blame themselves for emotional struggles they never caused. They may think they are too sensitive, too anxious, or too insecure, without realizing these traits are the residue of childhood environments where emotional safety was inconsistent or entirely absent. The world often says childhood scars fade with time. Psychology says the opposite. Emotional wounds deepen when they are ignored or misunderstood. They become the silent framework through which the person navigates life, shaping their choices, reactions, relationships, and self-worth. This chapter is a doorway into those hidden realities, the truths people often bury to protect the image of their parents or to avoid facing painful memories. But acknowledging these wounds is not about assigning blame. It is about recognizing the origins of suffering and understanding that your pain is real, your patterns make sense, and none of this was your fault. Healing begins with awareness. And awareness begins here, by naming the invisible wounds that shaped you before you had words to describe them. The internal working model, the silent manual of life. Imagine a young child entering the world with a mind as clear and unwritten as a new page. Every word spoken by a parent, every expression, every moment of presence or absence becomes a stroke of ink on that page. With time, these strokes accumulate, forming patterns, beliefs, and assumptions about how life works. This deeply personal and invisible manuscript becomes what John Bowlby called the internal working model, a subconscious script that shapes how a person interprets themselves, others, and every relationship they will ever form. This internal working model is not built through logic or conscious reflection. A child does not sit down and analyze, "My caregivers are emotionally unstable, therefore, I should not trust them." Instead, the child simply feels the consequences of instability. When affection is inconsistent, when emotional needs go unanswered, when the child's feelings are dismissed or belittled, the developing mind constructs its own explanation: there must be something wrong with me. This belief does not remain a childhood thought, it becomes a foundational lens that colors the rest of life. Over time, it evolves into the core of identity. A child who internalizes the idea that they are unworthy of stable love grows into an adult who doubts their worth in every environment, even when surrounded by supportive people. Toxic parents, whether intentionally or unintentionally, teach the child that love is conditional. Acceptance must be earned. Emotions must be trimmed, hidden, or reshaped to avoid conflict. Mistakes are not opportunities for learning but triggers for punishment or withdrawal. As the child tries to navigate these unpredictable emotional waters, they learn behaviors that eventually become automatic: staying quiet, shrinking themselves, pleasing others, suppressing pain, or becoming hyper-responsible. All these adaptations feed into the inner script: to be loved, I must be perfect, invisible, or endlessly giving. And when this script becomes part of the child's nervous system, it does not disappear with age. Even after leaving the childhood home, even after gaining independence and building a new life, the internal model remains active. It influences how the person responds to stress, how they interpret feedback, and how they approach relationships. A mild criticism at work may feel like a crushing failure. A delayed message from a friend may trigger fear of abandonment. A small disagreement may feel like a warning sign that love is about to disappear. These reactions are not irrational, they are echoes of early emotional programming. This internal model also determines how people relate to their own feelings. A child who is punished for crying learns to suppress sadness. A child who is ignored when afraid learns not to ask for help. A child who is shamed for expressing anger learns to swallow all frustration until it becomes overwhelming. By adulthood, they may appear controlled on the outside while emotionally collapsing internally. The internal working model also creates distorted predictions about relationships. Bowlby observed that these early emotional imprints teach a child to expect abandonment, rejection, or punishment. These expectations become automatic as the person grows up. People will leave me. I am unworthy of love. If I show my true self, I will be hurt. The painful irony is that these expectations often become self-fulfilling. When someone feels unworthy, they may choose partners who reinforce the belief. When someone expects rejection, they may behave anxiously, pushing people away. When someone is terrified of being vulnerable, they may sabotage good relationships without understanding why. This is not because they want to suffer, but because the emotional brain seeks what feels familiar, even when familiarity is painful. This chapter reveals the quiet power of early emotional experience. A child does not choose their internal working model, yet it becomes the compass that guides them long into adulthood. But this truth also contains hope. What was learned can be unlearned. What was shaped by pain can be reshaped by awareness. The first step is recognizing the script, seeing the invisible manual that has guided life for years. Only then can a person begin rewriting it into something that reflects who they truly are, not who their childhood taught them to be. Anxious ambivalent attachment, when love becomes fear. What happens when the only place a child should feel safe is also the place where they feel most afraid? This is the heart of anxious ambivalent attachment, a deeply painful emotional pattern that forms when parents are unpredictable, inconsistent, or emotionally unstable. Instead of providing steady comfort, the caregiver becomes a source of both closeness and distress, a paradox the child is too young to understand. In homes marked by emotional unpredictability, parents may behave affectionately one moment and become cold or rejecting the next. They might praise the child today and ignore them tomorrow, or show warmth in the morning and irritation by nightfall. These emotional shifts often happen without explanation, leaving the child confused and desperate to understand why love disappears so suddenly. Since a child cannot make sense of this inconsistency, their attachment system, the internal mechanism that seeks safety and connection, becomes overwhelmed. Rather than learning that emotional needs will be met, the child learns that love is unstable. Every moment of affection carries an underlying fear. Will it last? Will it vanish? Did I do something wrong? This uncertainty becomes fertile ground for anxious ambivalent attachment. Children raised in this emotional climate become hyper-attuned to their parents' moods. They study every facial expression, every change in tone, every shift in energy. Their nervous system enters a state of continual alert, constantly scanning for signs of rejection. This is not a choice. It is the body's desperate attempt to predict danger and prevent emotional loss. The presence of a caregiver, something that should bring comfort, instead brings tension. The child never truly relaxes. They cling tightly to affection when it appears, yet brace themselves for its sudden disappearance. Love becomes fused with anxiety, making emotional closeness feel both necessary and frightening. As these children grow into adults, the attachment pattern does not fade simply because they leave their childhood home. Instead, it follows them into every relationship they form. The adult with anxious ambivalent attachment longs for closeness but fears losing it. They crave affection but expect abandonment. They love intensely, but with a constant undercurrent of dread. Even in secure relationships, they may worry about being forgotten or replaced. A delayed response from a partner may trigger panic. A small disagreement may feel like a sign of emotional collapse. They might overthink every silence, replay every conversation, or assume the worst even when no threat exists. This anxious pattern becomes exhausting. The person may move back and forth between wanting closeness and pushing it away, pulled by conflicting impulses, the desire for connection and the fear that connection will lead to pain. They may become overly dependent, reactive, jealous, or emotionally overwhelmed, unintentionally creating the very distance they fear. This distance then confirms their internal belief: people will leave me. The cycle reinforces itself, generation after generation. A particularly painful consequence is the difficulty in recognizing healthy love. Adults with anxious attachment often mistake emotional intensity for emotional intimacy. They may feel drawn to partners who are unpredictable or emotionally unavailable, because their nervous system has learned to associate instability with love. Meanwhile, emotionally stable people feel unfamiliar, even boring. What is calm may feel unsafe, and what is chaotic may feel like home. This inversion, where the healthy feels wrong and the unhealthy feels magnetic, is not a flaw in character. It is the direct result of childhood conditioning. The emotional brain tries to recreate familiar patterns, hoping unconsciously to fix the past by repeating it. But the past cannot be healed through repetition. It can only be healed through awareness. Understanding anxious ambivalent attachment is not about blaming parents or shaming oneself. It is about recognizing how early emotional experiences shaped the nervous system, the mind, and the way love is understood. This chapter highlights a crucial truth. Your fears in relationships did not begin with you. They were learned in childhood, encoded into the body long before you understood the meaning of love or fear. But anything learned can be unlearned. The first step is naming the pattern, seeing how fear became attached to love. Only then can a new, healthier form of connection begin to grow. The lasting impact of toxic parenting on adult life. Most people believe that adulthood frees them from the influence of their childhood. They think that once they move out, build their own routine, and make their own decisions, the past no longer shapes them. But psychology, and lived experience, tell a different story. Growing up with toxic, unpredictable, or emotionally neglectful parents leaves behind an imprint that does not fade with age. It becomes a psychological mold that silently influences self-worth, relationships, behavior, and emotional reactions. Adults raised in these environments often carry patterns they do not recognize as the residue of childhood. They may struggle to make decisions, apologize excessively, fear expressing opinions, or feel deeply uncomfortable in social settings. They may constantly criticize themselves, second-guess their choices, or feel as though they are a burden to others. Yet instead of recognizing these as consequences of emotional neglect, they blame themselves. I'm too sensitive, I'm too dramatic, or I'm just not good enough. These beliefs were not born in adulthood, they were implanted during childhood through years of emotional invalidation. When a child is told, "Stop being dramatic," they learn to distrust their emotions. When they hear, "You're ungrateful," for expressing hurt, they learn to silence their needs. When they seek comfort and receive coldness or indifference, they learn that their feelings are inconvenient. Over time, they become experts at suppressing themselves. The tragedy is that many adults internalize these patterns so completely that they do not see them as wounds, they see them as personality traits. This is the hidden legacy of toxic parenting. The adult becomes their own critic, repeating internally what was once inflicted externally. They unconsciously recreate the emotional environment they grew up in, believing it is simply who they are. Bowlby described how early attachment experiences become the primary lens through which reality is perceived. This means that a childhood marked by emotional instability can shape every corner of adulthood, often without the person realizing the connection. They may avoid opportunities for fear of failure, sabotage relationships out of fear of being hurt, or chase perfection in the desperate hope of finally feeling enough. Another painful consequence is dysfunctional loyalty, a kind of emotional bondage created in childhood. Toxic parents often use guilt as a form of control. Statements like, "I did everything for you," or "You were always the difficult one," become psychological chains that bind the child's sense of duty to the parent's emotions. As adults, many feel immense guilt for setting boundaries, distancing themselves, or even acknowledging the harm they experienced. They confuse loyalty with self-sacrifice and believe that choosing their own well-being is a form of betrayal. This emotional imprisonment affects identity. When someone has been trained from childhood to minimize their needs, hide their feelings, and accept blame, they lose connection with who they truly are. They grow up without a clear sense of self because they were never allowed to develop one. The adult who was ignored as a child learns to ignore themselves. The one who was constantly criticized learns to criticize themselves. The one who was manipulated grows into someone who doubts every decision. Without realizing it, they become their own oppressor, carrying out the emotional roles once assigned by their parents. But the most important truth is this: these patterns are wounds, not defects. And more importantly, they can be healed. Bowlby emphasized that attachment styles are not destiny. Even deeply ingrained patterns can transform through what psychology calls earned secure attachment, a form of emotional healing built through awareness, supportive relationships, and consistent self-understanding. It begins the moment a person recognizes that their pain is legitimate, their reactions make sense, and their past still lives within them. Healing is not about blaming parents but about freeing oneself from the emotional residue left behind. It begins with noticing the patterns, seeing where they came from, and understanding that they were survival strategies, not personal flaws. This chapter is the turning point. It reveals that adulthood is not a separate world from childhood. The past lives quietly inside, shaping thoughts, reactions, relationships, and fears. But awareness provides the power to break the cycle, rewrite emotional patterns, and reclaim a sense of self that had been buried for years. Breaking the cycle, reclaiming your right to safety and love. Breaking free from the emotional legacy of toxic parents is one of the hardest, bravest decisions a person can make. It is not simply a matter of distancing from difficult people, it is the act of challenging a lifetime of conditioning, guilt, silence, and inherited emotional patterns. It requires confronting the painful truth that the people who were supposed to protect you may have caused your deepest wounds. And it requires releasing the hope that they will one day become who you always needed them to be. For many adults, this journey begins with a crisis of awareness. After years of trying to repair the relationship, explain their feelings, or prove their worth, they realize something life-changing: no amount of effort can fix what they did not break. You cannot heal a bond that was built on fear, guilt, or emotional deprivation. You cannot love someone into becoming emotionally healthy when they refuse to acknowledge the harm they caused. Toxic parents often use guilt to maintain control. They may say, "I did everything for you, you were the difficult one," or, "If I was tough, it was for your own good." These statements create confusion, making you doubt your own memories. But emotional pain does not lie. The body remembers the fear, the confusion, the loneliness. Healing begins when you trust your own pain instead of explaining it away. Breaking the cycle does not always require cutting off contact. For some, reducing communication, setting firm boundaries, or limiting emotional access is enough. For others, distance is necessary for survival. The truth is simple: you are allowed to choose the degree of relationship that protects your mental and emotional well-being. You are not obligated to be loyal to someone who repeatedly violated your emotional safety. The most profound part of breaking the cycle is not about changing the parent-child relationship, it is about changing the internal relationship with yourself. Growing up with toxic parents often forces a child to abandon their own identity in order to survive. They suppress their needs, silence their emotions, and shape themselves into whatever keeps the peace. Reversing this process requires learning how to inhabit yourself again. This means rediscovering your feelings without shame. It means allowing yourself to want things without guilt. It means accepting love, stability, and kindness even when they feel unfamiliar or uncomfortable. For those raised in chaos, emotional peace can feel like boredom, stability can feel suspicious. Healing requires learning to tolerate what once felt threatening: calmness, affection, reliability, boundaries, and unconditional care. A crucial part of the healing process is pursuing earned secure attachment, the emotional security that can be rebuilt even if it was never given in childhood. This rebuilding happens through self-awareness, therapy, healthy friendships, mature romantic relationships, and moments of compassionate self-reflection. Every time you treat yourself with understanding instead of criticism, you rewrite the emotional script that was handed to you. Every time you set a boundary, you reclaim a piece of yourself. Every time you refuse to accept manipulation, guilt, or emotional instability, you break another link of the chain. But healing also brings grief. Not just grief for the childhood you didn't have, but grief for the fantasy that one day your parents would realize, apologize, or change. Letting go of that fantasy is painful, yet necessary. It clears the space for something far more important, the chance to build a life where love is not earned through suffering, but given through respect, empathy, and emotional presence. Breaking the cycle is not an act of rebellion. It is an act of survival. It is the choice to end a generational pattern, to refuse to carry forward the wounds that were handed to you, and to begin writing a new emotional story for yourself and for those who come after you. You owe nothing to those who harmed you. The loyalty expected from you was manufactured through fear, not love. Your healing is not betrayal, it is liberation. It is the moment you choose your own emotional safety over someone else's emotional power. And in doing so, you reclaim what was always yours, the right to be treated with dignity, the right to feel safe, and the right to experience love without fear. This is the true meaning of breaking the cycle, not abandoning your past, but refusing to let it define your future.